Catharism was a Christian dualist movement that thrived in some areas of southern Europe, particularly northern Italy and southern France, between the 12th and 14th centuries. Cathar beliefs varied between communities because Catharism was initially taught by ascetic priests who had set few guidelines. The Catholic Church denounced its practices and dismissed it as the Church of Satan. Catharism had its roots in the Paulician movement in Armenia and eastern Byzantine Anatolia and the Bogomils of the First Bulgarian Empire, who were influenced by the Paulicians resettled in Thrace by the Byzantines. Though the term Cathar has been used for centuries to identify the movement, whether the movement identified itself with this name is debatable. In Cathar texts, the terms good men or good Christians are the common terms of self-identification. The idea of two gods or principles, one being good and the other evil, was central to Cathar beliefs. The good God was the God of the New Testament and the creator of the spiritual realm, contrasted with the evil Old Testament God, the creator of the physical world, whom many Cathars, and particularly their persecutors, identified as Satan. All visible matter, including the human body, was created by this evil God. It was therefore tainted with sin. This was the antithesis to the monotheistic Catholic Church, whose fundamental principle was that there was only one God who created all things visible and invisible. Cathars thought human spirits were the genderless spirits of angels trapped within the physical creation of the evil God, cursed to be reincarnated until the Cathar faithful achieved salvation through a ritual called the Consolamentum. From the beginning of his reign, Pope Innocent III attempted to end Catharism by sending missionaries and by persuading the local authorities to act against them. However, in 1208 Innocent's papal legate Pierre de Castelnau was murdered while returning to Rome after excommunicating Count Raymond Vi of Toulouse, who, in his view, was too lenient with the Cathars. Pope Innocent III then abandoned the option of sending Catholic missionaries and jurists, declared Pierre de Castelnau a martyr and launched the Albigensian Crusade. Origins. The origins of the Cathars' beliefs are unclear, but most theories agree they came from the Byzantine Empire, mostly by the trade routes, and spread from the First Bulgarian Empire to the Netherlands. The name of Bulgarians was also applied to the Albigenses, and they maintained an association with the similar Christian movement of the Bogomils of Thrace. That there was a substantial transmission of ritual and ideas from Bogomilism to Catharism is beyond reasonable doubt. The doctrines have numerous resemblances to those of the Bogomils and the Paulicians, who influenced them, as well as the earlier Marcionites, who were found in the same areas as the Paulicians. The Manichaeans in the Christian Gnostics of the first few centuries AD, although, as many scholars, most notably Mark Pegg, have pointed out, it would be erroneous to extrapolate direct, historical connections based on theoretical similarities perceived by modern scholars. St. John Damascene, writing in the 8th century AD, also notes of an earlier sect called the Cathara, in his book on heresies, taken from the epitome provided by Epiphanius of Salamis in his Panarion. He says of them, they absolutely reject those who marry a second time, and reject the possibility of penance, that is, forgiveness of sins after baptism. These are probably the same Cathara who are mentioned in Canon 8 of the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in the year 325, which states, if those called Cathara come over to the faith, let them first make profession that they are willing to communicate, share full communion with the twice married, and grant pardon to those who have lapsed. It is likely that we have only a partial view of their beliefs, because the writings of the Cathars were mostly destroyed because of the doctrinal threat perceived by the papacy. Much of our existing knowledge of the Cathars is derived from their opponents. Conclusions about Cathar ideology continue to be fiercely debated, with commentators regularly accusing their opponents of speculation, distortion and bias. There are a few texts from the Cathars themselves which were preserved by their opponents which give a glimpse of the inner workings of their faith, but these still leave many questions unanswered. One large text which has survived, the Book of Two Principles, elaborates the principles of dualistic theology from the point of view of some of the Albanenses Cathars. It is now generally agreed by most scholars that identifiable historical Catharism did not emerge until at least 1143, when the first confirmed report of a group espousing similar beliefs is reported being acted at Cologne by the cleric Abowin of Steinfeld. A landmark in the institutional history of the Cathars was the council, held in 1167 at St. Felix Lauriges, attended by many local figures and also by the Bogomil Papa Nicetas, the Cathar Bishop of France and a leader of the Cathars of Lombardy. The Cathars were largely a homegrown, Western European, Latin Christian phenomenon, springing up in the Rhineland cities in the mid-12th century. In the Languedoc and northern Italy, the Cathars attained their greatest popularity, surviving in the Languedoc, in much reduced form, up to around 1325 and in the Italian cities until the Inquisitions of the 1260s-1300s finally rooted them out. General beliefs. Cathars, in general, formed an anti-sacerdotal party in opposition to the Catholic Church, protesting against what they perceived to be the moral, spiritual and political corruption of the Church. G.K. Chesterton, the English Roman Catholic author, claimed, "The medieval system began to be broken to pieces intellectually, long before it showed the slightest hint of falling to pieces morally." The huge early heresies, like the Albigenses, had not the faintest excuse in moral superiority. Contemporary reports suggest otherwise, however. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, for instance, although opposed to the Cathars, said of them in Sermon 65 on the Song of Songs, "If you question the heretic about his faith, nothing is more Christian; if about his daily converse, nothing more blameless, and what he says he proves by his actions. As regards his life and conduct, he cheats no one, pushes ahead of no one, does violence to no one. Moreover, his cheeks are pale with fasting, he does not eat the bread of idleness, he labors with his hands and thus makes his living. Women are leaving their husbands, men are putting aside their wives, and they all flock to those heretics. Clerics and priests, the youthful and the adult among them, are leaving their congregations and churches and are often found in the company of weavers of both sexes." When Bishop Fulk, a key leader of the anti-Cathar persecutions, excoriated the Languedoc Knights for not pursuing the heretics more diligently, he received the reply, "We cannot. We have been reared in their midst. We have relatives among them and we see them living lives of perfection." Sacraments. In contrast to the Catholic Church, the Cathars had but one sacrament, the consolamentum, or consolation. This involved a brief spiritual ceremony to remove all sin from the believer and to induct him or her into the next higher level as a perfect. Unlike the Roman Catholic sacrament of penance, the consolamentum could be taken only once. Thus it has been alleged that many believers would eventually receive the consolamentum as death drew near, performing the ritual of liberation at a moment when the heavy obligations of purity required of perfecter would be temporally short. Some of those who received the sacrament of the consolamentum upon their deathbeds may thereafter have shunned further food or drink in order to speed death. This has been termed the endura. It was claimed by some of the Catholic writers that when a Cathar, after receiving the consolamentum, began to show signs of recovery, he or she would be smothered in order to ensure his or her entry into paradise. Other than at such moments of extremis, little evidence exists to suggest this was a common Cathar practice. The Cathars also refused the Catholic sacrament of the Eucharist, saying that it could not possibly be the body of Christ. They also refused to partake in the practice of baptism by water. The following two quotes are taken from the Catholic Inquisitor Bernard Guy's experiences with the Cathar practices and beliefs. Then they attack and vituperate, in turn, all the sacraments of the Church, especially the sacrament of the Eucharist. saying that it cannot contain the body of Christ. For had this been as great as the largest mountain, Christians would have entirely consumed it before this. They assert that the host comes from straw, that it passes through the tails of horses, to wit, when the flour is cleaned by a sieve, that, moreover, it passes through the body and comes to a vile end, which, they say, could not happen if God were in it. Of baptism, they assert that the water is material and corruptible and is therefore the creation of the evil power, and cannot sanctify the spirit, but that the churchmen sell this water out of avarice, just as they sell earth for the burial of the dead, and oil to the sick when they anoint them, and as they sell the confession of sins as made to the priests. Theology. Some believe that the Catharist conception of Jesus resembled non-Trinitarian modalistic monarchianism in the West and adoptionism in the East. Bernard of Clairvaux's biographer and other sources accuse some Cathars of Arianism, and some scholars see Cathar Christology as having traces of earlier Arian roots. According to some of their contemporary enemies, Cathars did not accept the Trinitarian understanding of Jesus, but considered him the human form of an angel similar to Docetic Christology. Zoe Acute Oldenburg compared the Cathars to Western Buddhists, because she considered that their view of the doctrine of resurrection, taught by Jesus, was, in fact, similar to the Buddhist doctrine of reincarnation. The Cathars taught that to regain angelic status one had to renounce the material self completely. Until one was prepared to do so, she would be stuck in a cycle of reincarnation, condemned to live on the corrupt earth. The alleged sacred texts of the Cathars besides the New Testament include the Gospel of the Secret Supper, or John's interrogation, and the Book of the Two Principles. Social relationships. Killing was abhorrent to the Cathars. Consequently, abstention from all animal food was enjoined of the perfecter. The perfecter avoided eating anything considered to be a byproduct of sexual reproduction. War and capital punishment were also condemned, an abnormality in medieval Europe. In a world where few could read, their rejection of oath-taking marked them as social outcasts. Cathars also rejected marriage. Their theology was based principally on the belief that the physical world, including the flesh, was irredeemably evil, as it stemmed from the evil principle or demiurge. Therefore, reproduction was viewed by them as a moral evil to be avoided, as it continued the chain of reincarnation and suffering in the material world. It was claimed by their opponents that, given this loathing for procreation, they generally resorted to sodomy. Such was the situation that a charge of heresy leveled against a suspected Cathar was usually dismissed if the accused could show he was legally married. Organization. It has been alleged that the Cathar Church of the Languedoc had a relatively flat structure, distinguishing between perfecter and credentus. By about 1140, liturgy and a system of doctrine had been established. It created a number of bishoprics, first at Albi around 1165 and after the 1167 council at St. Felix Lauriger's sites at Toulouse, Carcassonne, and Agen, so that 4 bishoprics were in existence by 1200. In about 1225, during a lull in the Albigensian Crusade, the bishopric of Razes was added. Bishops were supported by their 2 assistants, Affilius Major and Affilius Minor, who were further assisted by deacons. The perfecta were the spiritual elite, highly respected by many of the local people, leading a life of austerity and charity. In the apostolic fashion they ministered to the people and traveled in pairs. Role of women and gender. Catharism has been seen as giving women the greatest opportunities for independent action, since women were found as being believers as well as perfecta, who were able to administer the sacrament of the consolamentum. The Cathars believed that one would be repeatedly reincarnated until one commits to the self-denial of the material world, which meant that a man could be reincarnated as a woman and vice versa, thereby rendering gender completely meaningless. The spirit was of utmost importance to the Cathars and was described as being immaterial and sexless. Because of this belief, the Cathars saw women equally capable of being spiritual leaders. which undermined the very concept of gender held by the Catholic Church and did not go unnoticed. The women that were accused of being heretics in early medieval Christianity included those labeled Gnostics, Cathars, and Beguines, as well as several other groups that were sometimes tortured and executed. The Cathars, like the Gnostics who preceded them, assigned more importance to the role of Mary Magdalene in the spread of early Christianity than the Church previously did. Her vital role as a teacher contributed to the Cathar belief that women could serve as spiritual leaders. Women were found to be included in the Perfecta in significant numbers, with numerous receiving the consolamentum after being widowed. Having reverence for the Gospel of John, the Cathars saw Mary Magdalene as perhaps even more important than St. Peter, the founder of the Church. The Cathar movement proved to be extremely successful in gaining female followers because of its proto-feminist teachings along with the general feeling of exclusion from the Catholic Church. Catharism attracted numerous women with the promise of a sacerdotal role that the Catholic Church did not allow. Catharism let women become a perfect of the faith, a position of far more prestige than anything the Church offered. These female perfects were required to adhere to a strict and ascetic lifestyle, but were still able to have their own houses. Although many women found something attractive in Catharism, not all found its teachings convincing. A notable example is Hildegard of Bingen, who in 1163 gave a widely renowned sermon against the Cathars in Cologne. During this speech, Hildegard announced a state of eternal punishment and damnation to all those who accepted Cathar beliefs. While women perfects rarely traveled to preach the faith, they still played a vital role in the spreading of the Catharism by establishing group homes for women. Though it was extremely uncommon, there were isolated cases of female Cathars departing from their homes to spread the faith. In the Cathar group homes, women were educated in the faith, and these women would go on to bear children who would then also become believers. Through this pattern, the faith grew exponentially through the efforts of women as each generation passed. Amongst some groups of Cathars there were even more women than there were men. Despite women having an instrumental role in the growing of the faith, misogyny was not completely absent from the Cathar movement. Some seemingly misogynistic Cathar beliefs include that one's last incarnation had to be experienced as a man to break the cycle. This belief was inspired by later French Cathars, which taught that women must be reborn as men in order to achieve salvation. Another one is that the sexual allure of women impedes man's ability to reject the material world. Toward the end of the Cathar movement, French Catharism became more misogynistic and started the practice of excluding women perfects. However, the influence of these type of misogynistic beliefs and practices remained rather limited on the whole of Catharism, as later Italian perfects still included women.